She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "It would be wonderful for the neighborhood's image. The board agrees your yacht would make the perfect backdrop for our guests." That was the first moment I realized Karen didn't see boundaries, only opportunities for control. I declined, politely but firmly. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes turned sharp, a flicker of something cold, calculating. She nodded once, as if making a mental note, then turned to greet someone else like nothing had happened. The next morning, a notice was taped to my door. Dock maintenance violation. According to the HOA, my mooring lights were not up to visual code, and my deck furniture was inconsistent with community aesthetic. 2 fines. No warning, it didn't stop there. The following week, a board member happened to mention new discussions about restricting yacht sizes in residential docks. Then came whispers that I'd been uncooperative with community events. Soon, the friendly waves from neighbors turned into awkward glances. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. I'd been marked, and at the center of it all stood Karen, still smiling, still polite, quietly pulling every string she could. What she didn't realize, though, was that I wasn't the type to roll over. I'd spent too long building this life to let anyone, especially an HOA president with a clipboard, dictates how I lived it. What started as one denied request was turning into a battle for control of my own property. And by the time it was over, Karen would regret ever thinking she could use my yacht to show off her power. The first fine stung, but I told myself it wasn't worth getting worked up over. Maybe they were just being overzealous. Maybe Karen was proving a point, reminding me she ran this place. But then the second one came. And the third? Each envelope carried the same tone. Violation notice, corrective action required within 72 hours. They started small, a $50 fine for not lighting, another $100 for unsanctioned dock decor. But soon they escalated to hundreds of dollars for things that didn't even exist. Unauthorized gatherings, failure to provide adequate community access, refusal to participate in HOA-sponsored activities. That last one actually made me laugh. How could refusing to attend a cocktail mixer be grounds for a penalty? Still, I paid the first few just to keep things quiet. I'd worked too hard for this home to get dragged into a petty fight. But it became obvious these weren't simple mistakes, they were deliberate. Every fine, every inspection notice, every email was another small jab, a test to see when I'd finally push back. Karen didn't even try to hide it anymore. She'd stroll by my dock with her phone out, pretending to take photos of the sunset, but always pointing the camera toward my boat. Sometimes she'd have 2 or 3 other board members with her, all nodding and whispering like they were conducting some kind of audit. Then, one afternoon, I came home to find a letter taped to the hull of my yacht, an actual printed notice laminated and stapled to my property. It read, "Due to community access guidelines, your dock may be subject to shared use during HOA events." My jaw tightened. Shared use. That phrase again. It was her way of trying to force entry, to claim ownership over something she had no right to. I called the HOA office immediately, but they couldn't locate the board member responsible for issuing the notice. Every voicemail went unanswered. Every email bounced back with polite evasions. It wasn't incompetence. It was coordinated. By the end of the month, I'd received more violations than anyone else in the entire neighborhood. My property was spotless, my paperwork airtight, yet the HOA kept finding new excuses. Boat exterior too reflective, dock line obstruction hazard, lawn maintenance inconsistency. That one actually cited a single blade of grass growing through a crack in my patio. At first, I tried to reason with Karen. I called her, thinking maybe we could clear the air, but she didn't pick up. A day later, I found her standing by the community mailboxes, chatting with a group of residents. When she saw me approach, her tone changed instantly. The fake warmth, the overly sweet smile. I told her we needed to discuss the harassment and the bogus fines. She just smiled and said, "Everything we do is within HOA policy, dear. You agreed to the rules when you moved in." Then she turned her back and continued her conversation, like I didn't exist. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with oversight. I was dealing with obsession. The next few weeks were a slow descent into madness. Every time I left for work, someone seemed to be watching. Cars idled near my driveway a little too long. A board member named Greg started accidentally walking his dog past my house every night. One morning, I caught him leaning over the fence, peering at my pool like he was inspecting it for defects. Then, things got personal. My mailbox was filled with HOA newsletters that had handwritten notes, little jabs scrawled in pen. "You should learn to cooperate. Rules are rules. You're not special." The kind of psychological warfare that wears you down over time. I started documenting everything: dates, letters, timestamps from my security cameras. I wasn't going to be bullied into submission. I'd spent years working in law enforcement before this. I knew how people like Karen operated. Power wasn't about the rules. It was about intimidation. And the more you gave in, the deeper their hooks went. Then came the final straw. The inspection day, the HOA announced a surprise inspection of all waterfront properties to ensure compliance. I was home when the board showed up: Karen, Greg, and two others, clipboards in hand, bright yellow vests like they were on some official mission. They didn't even knock. They walked straight onto my dock, jotting notes and taking photos. I stepped out onto the deck and called down, asking what they thought they were doing. Karen barely looked up. "Routine review," she said, as if that excused trespassing. I told them to leave immediately, or I'd call the police. That finally got her attention. She turned slowly, expression cool and confident, and said, "You might want to be careful, Mr. Hayes. Violating HOA protocol can have serious consequences." Something about the way she said it, the way she looked at me, told me she wasn't bluffing. By that evening, I received an email titled Notice of Suspension. According to the board, my HOA privileges were temporarily revoked due to non-compliance. That meant no marina access, no community amenities, and no maintenance support. They even threatened to revoke my docking rights, the dock I owned outright. But what really sent me over the edge was the next line: pending review. The HOA reserves the right to access your vessel for inspection. That was it. She was coming for the yacht. I spent that night pacing, replaying every encounter, every smug smile, every violation that had no basis in law. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about humiliation. She wanted to prove that no one could say no to her. So I fought back. I contacted a property attorney and explained everything. He laughed at first, said he'd seen hundreds of HOA power trips, but his tone changed when I sent him the photos and letters. "This isn't regulation," he said. "This is targeted harassment." He helped me file formal complaints with the county and the State Housing Authority. I also submitted a request for a full financial audit of the HOA, every payment, every expense, every line item. That's when the tide started to turn. Within a week, whispers spread through the neighborhood. People who'd been silent started approaching me, neighbors who'd also been fined, harassed, or threatened. One couple told me Karen had forced them to repaint their home 3 times because the shade of white wasn't uniform. Another family got penalized for hosting a small birthday party because it created excessive noise. I wasn't alone. I was just the first one who said no. But Karen wasn't going down quietly. She called an emergency board meeting and sent out a notice accusing me of creating a hostile environment. She claimed I'd harassed her, that I'd been recording residents without permission. At first, I tried to reason with Karen. I called her, thinking maybe we could clear the air, but she didn't pick up. A day later, I found her standing by the community mailboxes, chatting with a group of residents. When she saw me approach, her tone changed instantly. The fake warmth, the overly sweet smile. I told her we needed to discuss the harassment and the bogus fines. She just smiled and said, "Everything we do is within HOA policy, dear. You agreed to the rules when you moved in." Then she turned her back and continued her conversation, like I didn't exist. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with oversight. I was dealing with obsession. The next few weeks were a slow descent into madness. Every time I left for work, someone seemed to be watching. Cars idled near my driveway a little too long. A board member named Greg started accidentally walking his dog past my house every night. One morning, I caught him leaning over the fence, peering at my pool like he was inspecting it for defects. Then, things got personal. My mailbox was filled with HOA newsletters that had handwritten notes, little jabs scrawled in pen. You should learn to cooperate. Rules are rules. You're not special. The kind of psychological warfare that wears you down over time. I started documenting everything, dates, letters, timestamps from my security cameras. I wasn't going to be bullied into submission. I'd spent years working in law enforcement before this. I knew how people like Karen operated. Power wasn't about the rules. It was about intimidation. And the more you gave in, the deeper their hooks went. Then came the final straw, the inspection day. The HOA announced a surprise inspection of all waterfront properties to ensure compliance. I was home when the board showed up, Karen, Greg, and 2 others, clipboards in hand, bright yellow vests like they were on some official mission. They didn't even knock. They walked straight onto my dock, jotting notes and taking photos. I stepped out onto the deck and called down, asking what they thought they were doing. Karen barely looked up. "Routine review," she said, as if that excused trespassing. I told them to leave immediately, or I'd call the police. That finally got her attention. She turned slowly, expression cool and confident, and said, "You might want to be careful, Mr. Hayes. Violating HOA protocol can have serious consequences." Something about the way she said it, the way she looked at me, told me she wasn't bluffing. By that evening, I received an email titled Notice of Suspension, according to the board. My HOA privileges were temporarily revoked due to noncompliance. That meant no marina access, no community amenities, and no maintenance support. They even threatened to revoke my docking rights, the dock I owned outright. But what really sent me over the edge was the next line, pending review. The HOA reserves the right to access your vessel for inspection. That was it. She was coming for the yacht. I spent that night pacing, replaying every encounter, every smug smile, every violation that had no basis in law. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about humiliation. She wanted to prove that no one could say no to her. So I fought back. I contacted a property attorney and explained everything. He laughed at first, said he'd seen hundreds of HOA power trips, but his tone changed when I sent him the photos and letters. "This isn't regulation," he said. "This is targeted harassment." He helped me file formal complaints with the county and the state housing authority. I also submitted a request for a full financial audit of the HOA, every payment, every expense, every line item. That's when the tide started to turn. Within a week, whispers spread through the neighborhood. People who'd been silent started approaching me. Neighbors who'd also been fined, harassed, or threatened. One couple told me Karen had forced them to repaint their home 3 times because the shade of white wasn't uniform. Another family got penalized for hosting a small birthday party because it created excessive noise. I wasn't alone. I was just the first one who said no. But Karen wasn't going down quietly. She called an emergency board meeting and sent out a notice accusing me of creating a hostile environment. She claimed I'd harassed her, that I'd been recording residents without permission. I wasn't surprised. When people like her feel cornered, they rewrite the story. Still, I went to that meeting. The room was packed. Board members, residents, even a few county officials who'd heard about the complaints. Karen sat at the head of the table, posture perfect, voice dripping with authority as she recited a list of infractions. That sounded more like character assassination than rule enforcement. But I came prepared. When she finished, I pulled out my folder, every photo, every letter, every time-stamped video showing her and her board violating the same rules they accused me of breaking. I laid it all out in front of everyone. The room went silent. Karen's smile faltered for the first time. Then I said just one thing. You wanted transparency, right? Let's start with yours. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away. One of them, Greg, stood up and quietly excused himself. I didn't need to say another word. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. But even then, I knew it wasn't over. People like Karen don't surrender. They scheme. And judging by the way she avoided my eyes as the meeting adjourned, I could tell she wasn't finished. As I walked back home that night, the marina lights glimmered off the water. My yacht sat quietly in the dock, resilient, unbothered by the chaos around it. But deep down, I knew the storm wasn't done brewing. Because when control slips through the hands of someone obsessed with power, they don't let go. They double down. And I had a feeling Karen was about to do exactly that. The day everything came crashing down started deceptively calm, the kind of morning where the air feels heavy, like it knows something you don't. I was sipping coffee on my deck, staring out at the still water when I noticed movement by the marina gate. Karen was there, clipboard in hand, uniform crisp and pressed, flanked by 2 HOA board members and a man in a reflective vest I didn't recognize. They were heading straight toward my dock. I set my mug down and walked to the edge of the deck, already feeling the familiar pulse of irritation in my chest. Karen didn't even greet me. She raised her voice, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Mr. Hayes, this is an official HOA inspection of your vessel. You've ignored repeated notices granting us access for compliance review." I kept my tone steady. "That yacht is my private property, not part of your jurisdiction. Step off my dock." Her smile was thin, brittle. "Failure to comply may result in suspension of community privileges and escalation to legal enforcement." Behind her, one of the board members, Greg, of course, nodded eagerly like a sidekick trying to impress his boss. The man in the vest started filming with his phone. That's when I realized it wasn't just an inspection. It was a show. She wanted an audience. I walked down to meet them, phone already recording. "If you set foot on that boat," I said quietly, "you'll be trespassing. And you'll be doing it on camera." Karen tilted her chin, smug as ever. "We're within our rights." Then she stepped forward. It happened so fast. 1 second she was on the dock. The next, she was climbing onto the yacht like she owned it. The others followed, cameras rolling, calling out fake violations as they went. Unregistered equipment, unauthorized signage, improper mooring procedure. I stood frozen, a mix of disbelief and fury churning inside me. I warned her. I gave her every chance to stop. But she wanted this. "Karen," I said, my voice sharp now, "get off, now." She turned to face me from the deck of my own boat and said the words that sealed her fate. "You don't own this community." "Mr. Hayes, we do." That was when the sheriff's car pulled up. 2 deputies stepped out, calm, professional, and, as fate would have it, one of them happened to be an old colleague from my days in law enforcement. His eyes went from me to Karen, then to the people filming on my dock. "What's going on here?" Must. Karen tried to seize control immediately, flashing her badge and paperwork like a cop in a movie. "We're conducting an HOA compliance inspection. This resident has been in repeated violation of our community policies." The deputy looked unimpressed. "On his personal boat." "Yes," she snapped. "It's community property." "It's not," I interrupted, stepping forward with my own folder. "Here's the deed, the registration, and a restraining notice filed with the county after prior harassment." He took one look at the paperwork, then at her. "Ma'am, you're trespassing on private property." Karen's face drained of color. "No, this is an HOA matter." "Not anymore," he said, voice low but firm. "Step off the vessel." "Now?" For a split second, she looked like she might argue, but something in his tone broke through her arrogance. She turned, muttering under her breath, and stepped back onto the dock. Her entourage followed, pale and silent. The man with the phone stopped recording. That should have been the end of it. But Karen wasn't done embarrassing herself. As soon as the deputies started walking away, she rounded on me, voice trembling with fury. "You think you've won? You don't understand how this works, do you? We have authority. I am the board." I stayed calm, almost eerily so. Not for long. 'Cause what she didn't know, not yet, was that the audit I'd requested had been completed. I pulled out my phone, opened the county report, and turned the screen toward her. It detailed every misused fund, every unapproved expenditure, every reimbursement that went straight to her personal account. Tens of thousands of dollars, all tied directly to her signature. Her eyes widened as she recognized the document. She tried to snatch the phone from my hand, but the deputy stepped between us. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd suggest you stop talking." But she didn't. She started shouting at me, at the officers, at her own board members, demanding they back her up, accusing everyone of betrayal. Greg looked at the ground, refusing to meet her eyes. The sound of her voice echoed across the marina, shrill, desperate, unraveling. And that's when the neighbors started coming out of their houses. Within minutes, half the community was watching from their porches, phones raised. This was the woman who'd fined them for leaving garbage cans out for 10 minutes too long, who'd threatened them with penalties for having wind chimes or mismatched shutters or children's toys on lawns. Now she was the one exposed, humiliated, cornered, powerless. She tried to recover her composure, forcing a trembling smile. This is a misunderstanding," she stammered. "These reports are incomplete." "I was authorized to approve those, not without a full board vote," Greg muttered. His voice was low, but the crowd heard it. Her head snapped toward him. "You little," he raised his hands. "Don't. I'm not going down for this, Karen." The sheriff's deputy spoke again. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, she didn't move, just stood there, shaking, staring at the people around her. Her neighbors, her subjects, as she probably thought of them. And now they were watching her be escorted off the dock, her clipboard dangling from her fingers like a broken scepter. As they led her away, I caught one last look, a flash of something between anger and disbelief. The kind of look only someone who'd built their entire identity around control could give when it's finally stripped away. And then she was gone. I stayed there long after the crowd dispersed. The sound of water lapping against the hull filling the silence she left behind. For the first time in months, the air felt light again. No tension, no eyes watching, no letters in my mailbox threatening fines. But I also knew this wasn't just about one woman. It was about every HOA, every neighborhood, every self-appointed enforcer who uses power to bully rather than protect. That night, the board held an emergency session without Karen. They voted to dissolve her position permanently, suspend all pending fines, and launch an internal audit of every policy she'd enacted. When they offered me a seat on the new board, I declined. I'd had enough of power games. All I wanted was peace. But as I locked up the dock and glanced out at the dark, glistening water, I noticed something taped to the side of my mailbox, a scrap of paper fluttering in the wind. I walked over, peeled it off, and read the words written in thick, angry ink. "You'll regret this." No signature. No handwriting I could match for sure. But I didn't need one, because even after everything, the arrest, the exposure, the humiliation, Karen wasn't done. And deep down, I knew this war with the HOA wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase. To be continued. When Karen was escorted away that afternoon, the marina finally went silent. For months, it had been the battleground of petty rules, anonymous threats, and constant tension. But in that moment, with her badge gone, her clipboard abandoned on the dock, it felt like the whole community exhaled for the first time in years. I stood there watching the sheriff's cruiser disappear down the long road leading out of the gated entrance, its reflection flickering across the water. It wasn't triumph I felt at first. It was relief, the kind that seeps in slowly after a storm you've been trapped in for too long. That night, the HOA held an emergency board meeting in the clubhouse. It wasn't the usual formal, smug affair where Karen sat at the center of the table, barking orders. This time, the lights were softer, the air quieter, and the people, my neighbors, actually spoke. Some were angry, some embarrassed. Most were just tired. Greg, the once loyal board member who'd spent months backing her every move, opened the meeting with a trembling voice. "We owe this community an apology," he said. "We let someone weaponize authority against our own residents. We forgot why we were elected to protect, not control." There was a long silence after that, followed by slow, scattered applause. I didn't stay long. I'd already said my piece, but as I left, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a while. People were talking to each other again. Not whispering, not gossiping. Talking, sharing stories about fines, letters, warnings, all the little moments of intimidation they'd endured in silence because they thought they were alone. Turns out, almost everyone had a Karen story. Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects of her downfall spread through the community like fresh air clearing out stale smoke. The HOA temporarily suspended all enforcement actions and opened a public review process. Residents could challenge fines, request refunds, and even submit complaints about board misconduct, and the stories poured in. There was the elderly couple who'd been fined $100 a day for having a mobility ramp without prior approval, despite providing medical documentation. A young family who'd been threatened for installing a small fence to keep their toddler safe near the marina. A widow fined for leaving her porch light on overnight because it disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic. All of it signed by Karen, every single one. The HOA's new president, quiet man named Douglas, who'd mostly kept his head down during her reign, ordered a full audit. The results were worse than anyone imagined. Misused funds, hidden expenses, inflated consulting fees, all leading back to her personal accounts. By the time the investigation wrapped up, Karen was facing charges for fraud and embezzlement. It was poetic justice, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the slow, grinding kind that actually sticks. Meanwhile, I went back to living the life I'd almost forgotten I had. Morning coffee on the deck. Evening walks by the docks. The hum of engines, the smell of salt water and varnish, the rhythm of peace returning. For the first time in months, I didn't tense up when my phone buzzed or when a white envelope showed up in the mail. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before started stopping by to talk. One man, Daniel, brought over a six-pack and said, "You know, we all thought you'd cave. Nobody ever stands up to them." I just smiled. Sometimes the only way to stop bullies is to remind them there's a line they can't cross. He nodded. Guess we forgot we had a say in how this place runs. And that, more than anything, became the real change. The HOA wasn't abolished, but it was rebuilt with transparency, community votes, and rotating board members to prevent another Karen from rising again. But even with peace returning, the shadow of her presence lingered, especially in the smaller details. Some nights, I'd find strange scuff marks on my dock ladder or notice my mailbox slightly open. Probably nothing, I told myself. Just paranoia. But there was one moment I couldn't shake. A few weeks after the arrest, I received a certified letter, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 6 words typed neatly across the center. You can't hide behind the water. No signature, no handwriting. Just those words. I handed it to the sheriff, who assured me it would be logged as evidence, probably from someone trying to stir trouble. Still, I couldn't ignore the chill that crept up my spine when I read it. Karen had always hated the water. She'd once said boats were symbols of arrogance, that people with yachts thought they were above the rules. Maybe that's why she targeted me from the start. Not because I broke any rule, but because I refused to bow to hers. Months later, when her trial finally came, I didn't plan to attend. But something pulled me there. The courthouse was small, tucked between government buildings downtown. When I walked in, Karen was already seated at the defense table, wearing a plain gray suit instead of her HOA uniform. Her hair was tied back, her face pale. She didn't look powerful anymore. She looked ordinary. As the prosecution laid out the evidence, the financial records, the testimonies, the letters she sent threatening residents, she stared straight ahead, expression unreadable. When the verdict was read, she didn't flinch. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud and misconduct. The judge sentenced her to community service, fines, and permanent removal from all HOA affiliations in the state. Not prison. But worse for her, I think. She thrived on control, on authority. And now she'd never have it again. When it was over, I stood quietly outside the courthouse steps, watching her walk out, flanked by her attorney. For a brief second, our eyes met. There was no anger, no gloating, just silence. Then she looked away and kept walking. And just like that, it was over. Life at the marina moved on. The community held a summer barbecue, the first one in years. Families brought food, music played, kids ran between the docks, and laughter echoed where tension once ruled. Someone even asked if I'd bring the yacht out for short cruises that evening. I agreed, but on one condition: everyone helped clean afterward. The crowd laughed, and for once, it didn't feel like I was the outsider. As the sun set, the water turned gold and glassy. The lights from the docks shimmered in long, bending lines across the surface. I leaned against the rail, watching the glow reflect off the hull, and thought about everything that had happened. How one person's obsession with power nearly tore apart an entire neighborhood. It made me realize something important. HOAs don't destroy communities. People do when they forget that rules are meant to protect, not control. And maybe that's the lesson in all of this. You can write pages of bylaws, hold endless meetings, issue fines, and enforce codes. But none of it matters if the people behind it lose sight of decency, respect, humanity. A few weeks later, I received another letter, this time from the new HOA president. It was short and simple. On behalf of the board and residents of Harbor Point, we'd like to thank you for standing up when the rest of us couldn't. You reminded us what community actually means. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it away in a drawer. Not because I needed the thanks, but because it reminded me of something deeper. In a world where power often hides behind rules and paperwork, courage still matters. Now, every time I step onto my yacht and feel the gentle sway beneath my feet, I think about that storm of a woman, Karen, and how she tried to claim ownership over something she could never understand. Freedom, the water doesn't belong to anyone. It flows, it shifts, it finds its own path. And maybe that's what this whole fight was about. not property lines or HOA codes, but the right to live without fear of someone else's control. As the evening breeze ripples across the bay, I can't help but smile. Because, for the first time in a long while, Harbor Point feels like home again. And as for Karen, wherever she is now, I hope she finally learned that no rulebook, no clipboard, and no title can ever make someone truly powerful. Only integrity can. Because at the end of the day, authority fades. But how you treat people, that's what leaves a mark. It started as a quiet Saturday afternoon on the marina, the kind of day I'd bought this house for. The water was calm, the sun sharp against the white decks of the yachts. But then she showed up, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like a crown, demanding that I unlock my yacht for her HOA guests because the community deserved to enjoy the view. When I refused, her smile vanished, and within hours, the HOA emails began. Fines, threats, warnings, all because I wouldn't bend. But what she didn't know was that this wasn't just about a yacht anymore. It was about control. And she was about to learn what happens when she pushes the wrong person too far. When I bought the house by the marina, I thought I'd finally made it, not in a flashy way, but in that quiet, hard-earned sense of peace you get when life finally slows down. The place was tucked behind white iron gates, where the streets curved gently around the water, and every yard had a perfect view of the docks. The HOA called it coastal luxury living. To me, it was just home, a quiet retreat where I could spend weekends out on the water, fixing up my old yacht, and enjoying the sound of the tide against the hull. For the first few months, it felt like paradise. I worked my weekdays in the city, came back Friday nights, and spent my mornings drinking coffee on the deck as sunlight shimmered across the bay. The neighbors were polite, if a little too polished. There was a certain sameness to everyone. The manicured lawns, the identical white fences, even the way people waved like they'd practiced it for the HOA's approval. Still, I didn't mind. I wasn't here to make friends. I was here to breathe. The yacht was my pride, a 42-foot classic I'd spent years restoring. It wasn't enormous, but it turned heads. The wood gleamed, the sails were crisp, and every piece of brass shone like it had a heartbeat. It sat docked right behind my property, tied neatly, an extension of my backyard. To me, it wasn't about status. It was about work, patience, and the calm that comes from rebuilding something piece by piece. That calm didn't last long. The HOA president, Karen Dawson, introduced herself the first week I moved in. She was the kind of woman who dressed like she was headed to a country club luncheon, even on a Tuesday morning pastel blazer. Pearl earrings, clipboard, always in hand. Her smile was wide, but her eyes never softened. She talked about maintaining standards, upholding community image, and shared access expectations. I nodded through it all, assuming it was the usual HOA formality. But I started noticing things. Karen seemed to watch everything: who trimmed their hedges, who left trash bins out a minute past pickup, who parked their car at the wrong angle. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was the self-appointed queen of the marina, and everyone knew it. People went out of their way to please her, baking cookies for board meetings, hosting community socials on her lawn, even inviting her to family barbecues they didn't want her at. It was easier to stay on her good side than risk her wrath. At first, I kept my distance. I paid my dues, followed the rules, and minded my business. But it became clear that the yacht, my yacht, had drawn her attention. She'd often stroll by the docks during her evening inspections, pausing a little too long to stare at it. Sometimes she'd comment on how exclusive it looked or how unfair it was that only certain residents could enjoy boats that reflected poorly on community balance. The first letter arrived 3 weeks later, a friendly reminder about marina access etiquette. It said all vessels docked within community property were subject to shared view privileges and Occasional member usage. I read it twice, thinking it had to be a joke. Shared view privileges. Member usage? This was my private dock deeded to my property. Still, I let it go. Surely, it was a misunderstanding. Then came the HOA event, the summer welcome social. Karen went all out, complete with banners, catering, and an open bar, all funded, of course, by community fees. Midway through the evening, she made her way to me, champagne glass in hand, smiling as if she'd just closed a deal. "We'd love to host the after-party on your yacht," she said casually, like she was asking to borrow a lawn chair. The words hit harder than they should have. I laughed politely, assuming she was joking. She wasn't.